we let them play with it and we let them experiment in such a way that then they can get a much better understanding of kind of what they actually need it to do. We pair that then with, yes, folks that are experienced on the WMS side that can advise them on this is maybe a good idea, this is maybe not a good idea, helping to just really understand what their particular pain points are. And then, yes, let's put a recommendation in or let's put something in to help them with that, knowing what the kind of eventual outcome that we want to get to.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. While there might be overlap between retail and manufacturing business models, they have uniquely different processes driving the need for distinct architecture and master data governance. While designing business processes and architecture, several decisions could have catastrophic impact on operational efficiency and enterprise performance. While any enterprise decisions are never easy, what makes challenging is that very little consensus exists in the role of enterprise systems, making it more art than science. In today's episode, our guest, Jonathan Porter, discusses different architectural patterns containing several supply chain technologies. He also probes into several factors driving decisions about choosing a specific technology or business process. Finally, he shares stories of his work and why they needed a new architecture. Let me introduce Jonathan to you. Jonathan Porter is a supply chain expert and the founder and CEO of Porter Logic, the supply chain tech stack for ambitious brands. After graduating with a degree in industrial and systems engineering from Georgia Tech, where he was also a Denning technology and management scholar, Jonathan has spent his career working with supply chain and business intelligence software at large established firms such as Manhattan Associates, as well as startups. He founded Porter Logic in November 2020 to help high-growth brands better manage their supply chain operations and fill gaps across their entire value chain. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey, Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam.
Of course, and this is always very exciting for me. You have a very similar background as we were talking in the pre-show. So it's always fascinating when I can get depth, out of people. And in your case, you are doing a lot of work in the supply chain space as well. So just to kick things off, do you want to start with your quick intro as well as what you are focusing on these days, Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jonathan Porter. I am the founder and CEO of Porter Logic. We are a supply chain tech stack for mid-market manufacturers and value-add distributors. I'm a super nerd about warehouses, so I spent my entire career in the WMS space, worked at Manhattan Associates, as well as a couple of other startups and smaller companies. So kind of cut my teeth implementing WMSs for really large firms like Cardinal Health and Reinhardt Food Service, and now we're helping more mid-market companies, specifically folks that are assembling or manufacturing goods. So that's a really interesting fulfillment challenge to actually take raw components and combine them into a finished product, and that's something that we help a lot of companies with. So yeah, we optimize inventory, we drive waste down, we help with things like on-time fulfillment and reducing the labor required to fulfill an order. So a lot of metrics that companies are caring about these days.
Okay, so very interesting, and I'm going to peel a lot of layers there. There's a lot of intel, that we can dig into. Before we do that, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest, and that is going to be, Jonathan, your perspective on business growth.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting time to talk about growth just because of the macro economics going on, right? There's so many people have been talking this recession into being for a couple of years now, but at the same time, we're seeing growth in a lot of areas that we may not have seen 5 or 10 years ago. So things like food delivery and food distribution in general has changed drastically as we've gotten more comfortable with things like ordering online, but also even ordering groceries and ordering meal kits and things like that weren't around for a long time. So a lot of the customers we talk to are in a growth mindset. They're, expanding business and trying to capture new market. From our perspective, as a startup, we're also growing. We've tripled the team size in the last year. We're, in a position that we're doing positively, which is a good thing. But we're seeing a lot of positive growth, and it's an exciting time. But at the same time, we also know that a lot of companies are struggling and not growing and not moving in the right direction. So it's an interesting time to be operating supply chains. There's no question.
Yeah, and very interesting perspective as well. And I kind of agree with your assessment, to be completely honest. So let's go back to the layers that we wanted to hit on from your previous commentary. And one approach that we can take is I want to discuss a little bit of macro perspective, because you spent time with your Manhattan. You did mention that, right? So overall, from the macro perspective, and I look at this, right? In the supply chain space, obviously, Manhattan is probably going to be really good at retail distribution. They don't necessarily get into the manufacturing space. And that's where sort of your comment was that, hey, I like to combine these raw materials to finished good. And you probably have a case study as well, or a story that you might be able to touch on related to that, right? So overall, what I want you to do is describe the difference between the manufacturing supply chain versus the distribution supply chain, and different players that might be there, if they are going to be good fit, for example, manufacturing versus distribution.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Manhattan makes a lot of excellent supply chain software for the enterprise space, but they really do focus a lot more on retail and that retail distribution of bringing in a finished good. If you're, a Nike distribution center, for example, and you bring in a finished shoe and then you ship out a finished shoe. That is kind of one approach. That's one, kind of customer flow, right? Versus, if you're bringing in raw components and having to assemble those together, there's a lot of different challenges that arise that traditionally fall kind of outside of systems or across systems. So, for example, a warehouse management system, WMS, is really typically within your four walls. So it's managing the inventory receiving, it's managing, your cycle counts, your picking and packing. But that's what it does. That's kind of its existence. Versus then you typically also may have a demand planning or an MRP or a procurement system or something that's helping your purchasing team, manage POs and actually deal with your vendors and suppliers. Well, those are both challenges that you face if you're in this manufacturing use case, right? If you are bringing in components and putting them all together, you need to have everything at the same point and at the same time. You can't just, bring in, your Nike shoe and then ship it out. You have to work with all your vendors and suppliers to then be able to make sure that you have those components at the right time. So you really need to blend that procurement and WMS. And that's something that's not a lot of other systems have done, or is not something that is done as a modular componentized way, because it is a fundamentally different challenge to manage all of those vendors and get them to ship in inventory at the right time. I mean, even just things like delivery appointments, right? If you've started a production run and, one carrier hasn't shown up, like how do you manage that, right? And it sounds so easy, but we all know that in the real world, that is the kind of stuff that really is a challenge. And even just your goods may be sitting on your receiving dock and they may not know that, your kitchen needs that particular product right now. So figuring out ways to deal with that is something that, was really interesting to me, just as I learned more and more about the WMS side of the world. I also found system integration fascinating. So when I was at Manhattan, I developed a close friendship with somebody that really took me under their wing on the integration side and taught me a lot about middleware and how to get systems talking. And I thought it was magic almost, right? Of how you can send data between these systems. But that's a really inherent component that you have to have also if you're in this manufacturing, use case, because you're going to, and I mean, it's true for anybody, but you're going to be sending data between systems. And how do you systems talk in ways, where
Yeah.
do the lines fall between systems? Should this fit into a WMS? Should this
Yeah.
be in your ERP? Like,
Yeah.
these are all questions that, especially as just fulfillment has changed, and
Yeah.
fulfillment has changed drastically, just, I mean, the last 5 years, but even as e-commerce has risen the last 10 or 15, right? I mean, it's just the fulfillment environment we're operating in now is so different than it used to be. So those lines have blurred a lot between systems, and every company has their own slight definition of like, what is MRP for you
Yeah.
versus what is MRP for me.
Yeah.
So those are all the types of challenges that we started really looking at and saying, like, wait a second, there's got to be a better way than these legacy on-premise Oracle-based systems, right?
Yeah.
Those were great at the time, but like
Yeah.
we've kind of moved on from that. So
Yeah. So very interesting perspective again. And I'm going to touch on some of those layers. And this is my favorite topic as well. Okay. And I have not figured this out, to be completely honest. So maybe you can help me with that. Okay. What should reside in WMS versus ERP? There's always challenges. That is number one. Number two, when you get into different industries, they all are going to have very different architecture, very different philosophy. Sometimes it's very hard to sort of argue with these executives because that's the way they have always sort of seen it, done it, and they are not willing to change, right? So one thing that you mentioned, and I'm going to narrate different sort of touch points from the WMS perspective, right? And that's what you were talking about. So for example, you have three different touch points in my mind when it comes to, okay, where you are going to have WMS. And in my mind, when I look at any sort of WMS centric processes, right? It's always going to be some sort of barcode interaction. That's where WMS is going to be in play. Or any of the hardware, the newer WMS systems that you are going to have in the market, they are going to be talking to a lot of different hardware systems, for example, your ASRS, etc., or any of the robotics systems, right? So that's where, in my mind, again, WMS is going to be play. So three touch point again. Number one is going to be your customer side, which is going to be your return side of the processes. Number two is going to be your procurement side of the processes. That's what you were talking about. Hey, you are going to receive all of these goods. That's going to be your procurement. In that also, you are going to have some sort of quality centric workflows. In the customer, that's probably not going to be as busy unless you have like 50% return rate, right? That could be busy as well. But then the third one that you are talking about is very interesting, which is going to be in between your production. And when you have these in between or in processes, okay, they get very interesting because you are not sort of hijacking the flow from your ERP to WMS, and when you have to return this control, and that's where your integration becomes very, very, very tricky. So in my experience, from the integration perspective, if you are doing slightly simpler model, okay, you have sort of defined workflows between systems, then you can control the state of master data. Otherwise, it becomes very, 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 very difficult. So I don't know what has been your experience. Maybe touch on a little bit in terms of how you define the architecture, and the story that you want to touch on. Maybe describe from their perspective, how did you manage the master data? What was sitting inside ERP versus what was sitting inside WMS?
Sure. No, and that's, great, Tia, because that is a fundamental challenge of any of these systems is what falls into what, right? And you mentioned in the beginning, like, executives have perhaps their way that they've done things and like they're set in their ways. I'd say that like our answer to that actually is to give the control back to the business. And because every company operates in a unique way. They have something that they're doing differently. And so they need the ability to define their own boundaries. They need the ability to say, for our particular business, this makes sense and this is why. That's something, traditionally systems try to fit you into their mold. They have to say, this is what our POs look like. This is what our ASNs look like. But in our case, we've kind of taken the opposite approach and we've built the software to be able to support that in a very quick way. So and I'll give you, so Thistle is one of our biggest customers. They are a food kit manufacturer. So they bring in raw food and then they have kitchens within their distribution facilities where they're cooking and prepping ready to eat meal kits that they then ship on a subscription basis to their customers. So there's that kind of unique assembly combination. So because most of our customers are not necessarily just pure manufacturers, there's also the distribution and storage component of it. If all you're doing is, just pure manufacturing, then there are other, MESs out there that may be a good fit. But as soon as you add in that WMS and storage component of it, that's where you kind of get this interesting combination, as you mentioned, of the, where do system lines blur. So they had an ERP that they had implemented. It was a very food-specific ERP called Galley, and really it was almost more of a warehouse or a kitchen management system in a lot of ways. It was very recipe-specific. It has all these details about nutrition facts and whatnot. Like, it's very tailored to food. Didn't have as much on the warehousing side of things and needed some help on the procurement side as well, because they had, as most companies do, they had bolstered that ERP with a mountain of spreadsheets. So they were using Google Sheets in a lot of different ways to kind of fill gaps around this other system. And, you know, honestly, to no fault of any ERP, like an ERP is great at what it does, but then a lot of times it tries to get bastardized into all these other supply chain processes. And that's kind of where our technology then plugs in and fits in, is that let your ERP continue to do what it's good at. We typically don't actually end up replacing the ERP with most of our customers. We then plug in around all of that and kind of fill those supply chain operational gaps. So they, in particular, were really focused on food waste. I think that that's something that any assembler should be very focused on, waste and yield, because you can get more out of the components you're bringing in. You can inherently improve your margin. So they were focused on reducing waste. They were also focused on improving inventory accuracy. Again, that's something really important with food, to make sure that you have very barcoded, you know, lot numbers and expiration dates, and that you know where all your inventory is. Making sure that you're allocating by FEFO so that you're using first expiring inventory, things like that. So we came in and helped them with both a procurement management as well as warehouse management, automated a lot of those extra processes, but built them in such a way that they could define what those boundaries are, kind of as we were talking about at the beginning. So they have a couple of different procurement flows, meaning that, you know, they purchase certain goods that have really long lead times on a particular schedule. They then purchase things like produce that are much faster delivery on a particular way. So we're able to build workflows around the way that they want to operate. So there's our answer to your question of, you know, what fits into what, is we let you tell us, and then we build the system in such a way that it can kind of conform to your particular business processes.
Yeah, so very interesting. So I am going to provide a little bit of counter perspective on that. And let's see, I don't know if you have similar experiences in your client base, and definitely open to hear that, right? So one of the things, or the comment that you made, is, you know what, businesses, we go by whatever businesses generally want, right? So in this case, I guess it's probably going to be some of the users that you are speaking to. In our experience, when we deal with our customers, to be completely honest, so they are going to be really good at understanding their processes, but they are not necessarily as good at understanding what are going to be the implications because of their decisions. So cross-functional decisions and the collaboration and the master data governance is where the real problem is in general in our experience. For example, let's say, and I want to understand your architecture a little bit more, because you mentioned that, you know what, you were able to do LIFO, FIFO in that. And if you don't sort of follow the layers and the principles, underlying principles that you need to follow, it's very rare that you are going to get the inventory accuracy in general in our experience, right? So the way we like to see these things is, if you follow the accounting, fundamentals, the supply chain fundamentals, then you are going to build the scalable model. And if you are going to take any sort of shortcuts, then it's going to be really hard to scale that model. So maybe, I don't know, Missy, do you share very similar experiences? Or when you talk to these business users, whatever they are saying, do you feel that there are going to be some process improvement issues as well? Or do you typically model, whatever the business users are going to say?
No, I think that you're really spot on here, because I think that business users are experts at their particular field, what they know, and they are experts at their particular business as well, right? They know the nuances of how they need to operate. But you're exactly on point that translating that into a software solution that's going to be both scalable for their operations and also, they not let them shoot themselves in the foot. That's a really important piece, and that's actually something that we recognized, and so we offer that as somewhat of a white glove service to our customers. So customers of ours will buy a WMS, but they're getting along with that the services from experts that come in and tell them, here's how, here's some of these best practices. We have a very iterative model. So that was one of the things that I learned from previous implementation experience, that there's no replication for getting a system in front of a user and getting that real feedback, right? From a business process perspective, the best way is to get the actual users that are going to be doing this to tell you. So we intentionally build that into our onboarding process, process so that customers very quickly get their hands on a template, even if it's not exactly built to them. We have a whole library of starting points for here's 5 different ways of doing receiving. Here's 5 different ways of doing procurement. And so we let them play with it and we let them experiment in such a way that then they can get a much better understanding of kind of what they actually need it to do. We pair that then with, folks that are experienced on the WMS side that can advise them on, this is maybe a good idea. This is maybe not a good idea. Helping to just really understand what their particular pain points are. And then, let's put a recommendation in, or let's put something in to help them with that. Knowing what the kind of eventual outcome that we want to get to is. So I think that I think WMS in general, but supply chain systems overall are interesting because it's repeatable modules, but it is different every time. And that's somewhat of how we've built our system. It's like we've componentized and made it into composable modules of, just the pieces that you need, and not just WMS. We go way deeper than that into here is what cycle counting looks like. And there's a bunch of iterations of that. Here is what an inventory audit looks like. And why is that different than cycle count? And so you can pick and choose just exactly the pieces that you want, and then even further configure those in a very low code environment so that you can make changes. I mean, all of the screens you can just click into and make changes directly, which is something that some systems are catching up on. But it's that level of flexibility that you need to be able to then mold and fit to a business process. Users should not have to think as they're going through these systems, right? They shouldn't have to remember, F2 means this, and then, hold down shift and control to perform this action. Like, that is, systems of the past. We need systems now to tell users very specifically what they need to be doing, because, I mean, I'm sure you see it too. Labor is a huge challenge right now. Turnover is high. Training, how can you get users productive faster? If they can just, log into a mobile friendly experience similar to what they're used to on a phone and just be told, here's exactly what to do. I mean, that makes it makes it so much easier to shift labor between departments and kind of mold and, morph your operations as needed. So it all goes back to having a system that you can, modularize and componentize in such a way that it puts together and actually fits what you're trying to do.
Yeah, so very interesting. So I want to go back to, some of the comments. For example, let's say you had mentioned that, you have a very specific definition of ERP. And typically in our experience, I mean, we have probably seen 10,000 different definitions in terms of, what an ERP is, right? And the scope also varies per industry depending upon how many different systems you are using, how many different, how your transactions are. Typically, the definition of ERP inside retail is going to be very different from your manufacturing. Once you get into the real unit costing scenarios, retail, you don't need to worry about cost. Come on, like $10 product, who cares? How much you're losing. For, in retail distribution, you are more worried about speed. But when you get into the real industrial distribution scenarios, or maybe in the manufacturing scenarios, then the cost accounting becomes far more critical in general. And then if you are slightly more in the quality processes, then you are going to have a lot more issue in doing these cross-functional processes. So in your experience, let's say so the way you were defining, okay, this is what ERP is supposed to be doing, or they are good at. So what is that state in your mind for ERP?
Yeah, so the way that we often think about ERPs is that is your core central accounting and finance system, primarily. It does a lot of other things, but if you really boil it down to, it's all the costing, it's pricing, it's, cost centers and things like that. That is one of the primary pieces that an ERP needs to fill. Now, it bleeds into a lot of other areas because it needs to be inventory aware. It needs to know your inventory position because that's a major asset that goes into, so that is where, there's this kind of spectrum of like, what is ERP versus what is supply chain system. We kind of say we are the other end of that spectrum. For your supply chain operation, you need an equivalent system to your ERP that's going to work very closely and in conjunction to then let those lines blur, right? To your point, there is no single definition of like, here is exactly what ERP means. You can do MRP planning in an ERP, you can do MRP planning in a procurement system, but being able to say for our business, this is what makes the most sense, then having systems that can work in conjunction with that. So ERPs are usually more static or more, kind of ingrained. And so that's where we've built the system that can morph around that. So you're not having to replace an ERP, you're not having to, rip out the entire system, but you do need to be able to say, for our particular business, we are very demand constrained. So our main metric is uptime. We want our lines running as much as possible. Therefore, we need for manufacturing execution to be one of the, primary pieces. So all right, that makes sense for your business. Anyway, to your question though, you went back. So yes, what is ERP is such an interesting question because even the same exists for what is WMS.
Yeah.
Even I think of WMS as a much more contained thing because it is within four walls.
Yeah.
But then you'll talk to people and it's like, well, why doesn't the WMS do that? Like, shouldn't the WMS just do that? That was like one of the questions that I feel like you just hear constantly. But I think that the real reality is there are fundamental functions that you have to perform if you are shipping physical goods. You have to get an order from a customer. You have to decide where that order is getting fulfilled from. You have to say direct people to how are they going to fulfill it? How are they going to pick it? How are they going to pack it? You have to then have inventory to fulfill that. So, I mean, you can break it down into these building blocks and, this is what you have to do to be able to fulfill that order. So then from there, yes, look at the kind of ERP versus supply chain tech stack and kind of figure out which one makes the most sense to be in. Most of the times I would say that accounting, financials, cost, anything like that should definitely live ERP. Anything that's day-to-day transactional that users are doing, whether it's picking, packing on the floor, or whether it's creating purchase orders, kind of those transactional level things that users are doing every day, that should fit more into your supply chain operations system. And then, where the kind of come together is then the most interesting parts. And master data management, or how to, who's the product owner, who owns the product master, and who owns, the purchase orders. And those are all decisions that kind of need to be made in the context of where those functions are occurring. If you have a procurement, function happening in your supply chain systems, your supply chain system should probably be the system of record of PO. If you have a operation occurring, and if instead you're doing MRP planning in your ERP and generating purchase orders in your ERP, well then ERP should be the system of record for purchase orders. So that's kind of how we fundamentally make that decision.
So very interesting perspective. So now let me ask you this question, okay? So you are defining this as an ERP, but as such, what you are doing there is literally financial reporting, accounting. That's what you are doing. You are not necessarily utilizing an ERP, the intent of ERP, what it is supposed to be completely honest, in this particular architecture. So now the question I'm going to have for you is, do you even need an ERP? Because technically what you are trying to do is you are literally trying to recreate ERP inside these point systems, to be completely honest. So I mean, in some businesses that is going to be a need. For example, let's say if you look at retail, again, they don't care for cost accounting, and in their case, they don't need to know the financial state of the transactions. And that's why they don't worry about these things. So they can keep, let's say, for example, if you look at allocation, they can keep inside WMS. And that's why if you look at Manhattan, Blue Yonder, all of these systems, they are probably keeping 90% of the business processes. So why do you need an ERP? Just get an accounting system. Right? But I mean, that's not going to work for manufacturing.
Well, in some ways, it's a very interesting question, and yes, I definitely see where you're coming from, because it's a different approach to how to put your supply chain operations together from a systems perspective. ERPs started with accounting and bled this way. We're starting on the other side and kind of coming at it this way, and I do think that there is a need for ERPs in this ecosystem, but it does depend a lot on the particular business processes that you need. So I'll go back to Thistle, and Galley as the ERP is very food specific, and it has an infinitely nesting recipe system so that you can have these highly complex recipes that you're cooking, and actually will do a lot of aggregation around how it's going to put customer demand together, and it's going to do promotions and things like that. So there is some very point pieces that our system isn't going to do, and that I think it should still live in an ERP. But it does allow the ERP to become a lot more specialized in its own way, and you can start choosing an ERP that's going to fit your particular need, as opposed to having to choose just the entire box. Right? I think that's one of when ERPs first came out, they had very standard function, but then as businesses proliferated, ERPs, everybody just kind of kept trying to throw it into the ERP because it's your central system. It's probably the largest system you have. It's probably the most expensive system you have. So just keep throwing it in. And, after 30 years of customizing, people have started saying, like, well, is one more modification really the answer? Or is there a whole different way of thinking about it? I mean, I can't tell you how many database triggers that I have unfortunately been involved in writing over the course of years. And like, that is just the nature of how these systems grew up. But it is, if you start kind of breaking it down into the fundamental pieces that you really need,
Yeah.
that's it just allows you to start combining things in a different way. And that is the kind of whole premise of this composable and headless movement. It's swept through e-commerce. So like e-commerce headless is like the latest trend, but that's just starting up for supply chain and taking that same composability concepts and putting it into a way, well, okay, yeah, let's modularize it. Let's just do cycle counting or just do receiving and like break it down into these pieces that you can then put together. So you asked the question of, do you still even need the ERP in that scenario? And I think that I'd say that it just depends on your business. It depends on your users. I do think that there are businesses that could get away with just an accounting system, but see, then they may need a pricing solution. And so, okay, is there a component there? Is there a master data system, for example, that, maybe you deal in pharma and have highly regulated and need to be able to, keep up with things there. So, I think that that's the really core of it, is it lets you become a lot more componentized and modular as a business, and you no longer have to rely on buying the entire ERP and, just using 10% of it.
So very interesting comment there. So I'm going to touch on the composability from the e-commerce perspective. And honestly speaking, I'm a big proponent as well of the composable concept, especially in the e-commerce world. Okay. But the reason for that is because in there, the composability is very different. The kind of composability that you are going to require for e-commerce transactions, in those transactions, the database interaction does not matter as much. Okay. But when you look at the database to database reconciliation, that's where the real problem is. If you are going to create too many different data silos, you are going to get a lot more problems in general from the master data governance. When you are looking at the e-commerce composability, unless you are sort of booking the order, who cares what you have done? Even if you have lost, let's say, one interaction, who cares? So you are not necessarily reconciling to penny, and that's why composability in that case is okay. And that actually brings a lot more power, because they need that power from the transactional volume perspective. If you look at retail, sometimes the demand is going to be so high that you need to scale up, and they are able to reduce their infrastructure footprint. They are able to save a lot of money. They are able to handle demand. So there are a lot of different benefits of composability for e-commerce. But when you look at the backend systems, and typically right now, see, if you look at any of the programming languages, I guess, they all are very influenced by front-end developers, to be completely honest. Okay, but they never had as much experience in these database-driven processes. Database-driven processes is where the real challenges are when you get into these core issues of reconciling different data silos. So if you are going to have too many different data silos, it becomes very difficult. I don't care, which architecture you use. That's been my experience. So I don't know if you have any counter on that, I guess.
No, breaking down data silos has to be a part of that conversation. And you're right, it's fundamentally different. And there's a reason that it hasn't come into supply chain yet, because you do have to approach it with a slightly different mentality. I think that one of the keys is you have to have a single system of record for every different data type and data point, right? You should not have two places that are managing products independently, right? That's one of the primary core pieces. Our solution to that is we make a decision on who's going to own that, and then we do the syncing in either direction. So if we are the system of record, we push out into all the other systems. If we're not the system of record, we do a polling of some sort to make sure that we constantly stay in sync. So, but deciding, and even down to your transactional level information too, purchase orders or sales orders, like there needs to be one system of record and one single source of the truth for that. And then having the ability for the systems to kind of blend and move data on between those, that's where you kind of start getting this composability within supply chain. The ability to then allow for, okay, just this one point solution. Well, if you're going to put in just a receiving solution, it has to be able to push and pull data in real time to make sure that the source of truth is up to date. If you're relying on some type of a manual upload or something even, or a data keying, like that's not going to work. So having a system and that's part of where integration is such a big component of what our platform is, the ability to read data in and out from a variety of different systems, no matter how legacy. The example I love to give is we can pick up automated emails from legacy systems. As simple as that sounds, a legacy system that can schedule an email report with an attached Excel sheet. Our system can automatically pick that up and process that. And to people outside of supply chain, that may sound really trite, but how many legacy systems are out there that don't have a simple API connection, don't even know what an API is, but have the ability to schedule these emails out. So we've built the integration components of our platform in a very intentional way to work within a supply chain setting, because that was part of what we recognize as things. I mean, I love Zapier. I use Zapier all the time, but you try and use Zapier to connect two WMSs and it's probably not going to work all that well. So you need to be able to, that integration component is a core tenet of making composability work, because yes, you can't have data silos anymore. I mean that, and even we're getting to a point that like a BI layer on top of your systems isn't even good enough anymore. That was a great step in the right direction, but you now need insight. You now need action. It's no longer good enough to just say, well, here is, my aggregated inventory position. You need a system that can automatically start telling you, well, here's your inventory position, but here's the 5 things you need to look at, and here's what you need to do about it, and here's the way to do that action.
Okay, amazing, man. So we are close to our time now. I don't know if you're going to have any sort of closing advice for our listeners.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, you can tell I'm passionate about warehousing in general. I think that the world has seen how important it is over the last couple of years. And as terrible as the pandemic was, it's really neat to see how much supply chain is getting a boost, because people now see, I couldn't get toilet paper for years, and it's a really important component. So fulfillment is a fascinating thing, and I'd say that more people should learn about what happens before you click buy on Amazon. That I think, or any e-commerce, because I feel like that nobody understands what happens behind the scenes. People, are ordering things online and it doesn't show up 2 days later and you get mad, and you don't realize that 18 people have touched that, and that box hit 7 different trucks and went across the ocean. And it's really fascinating what goes on behind the scenes. And, as more people are kind of getting into it and peeling back the layers. So not really closing advice as much as just saying it's a really neat component of what's happening right now with supply chain systems. So.
Could not agree more. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be that supply chain is probably one of the areas which is probably seeing a lot of changes, and there are going to be a lot of changes even in the future. So if you don't have the technology that is really going to scale for your supply chain processes, you need to think about that.
Definitely. And even Gartner's saying that. I mean, so Gartner had in their 2023 report on supply chain strategy, Gartner said that by 2026, over 30% of supply chain applications will use a composable architecture. So it's the direction that everything's going, and embracing these different ways of doing systems is the new trend. So.
Love it. Again, thank you so much for your time. This has been a powerful episode.
Thanks so much for having me. Love this.
Of course. I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you would like to learn more about Jonathan, head over to porterlogic.com. It's porterlogic.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform, or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.